All right. Good morning. How you
Good
doing?
morning. I'm good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming through. I was
Yeah.
I was thinking this morning, we had this crazy thunderstorm at like 2 a.m. and we did not announce it on Thunderwatch. So here we are, gonna do the postmortem. I can
Yeah.
yeah, there was rain. Okay, there we go. That's what
Yeah,
we
it
saw.
was really bad. There was this one thunder that woke me up and I was like, "What is that outside?" And I was afraid it's gonna wake up the kids and they're gonna come down. And they did one of them did eventually. And she wasn't feeling so well.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's some loud thunders here.
Yeah, it's that force in nature, right? That's I think what we're talking about is how does that translate to companies who are going to change things? But man,
Yeah.
when it comes in fast and furious. So it's a great
Yeah.
analogy. But I don't know if it's this year. I don't know if it's just like climate changing here in Houston, but it feels like the windstorms are just rougher than they were in years past. Like we had that windstorm last year, but even this whole season feels super windy, and I don't know if it's just because I have a house now and I notice all the creaks whenever those storms come in, or if it's just a real change in kind of the weather pattern.
Yeah, no, it's hard to know because Houston has been windy, and then you feel it especially in the winter days, a lot more. In the summer days, it's kind of appreciated. Um, but yeah, it's it's we're known for the tropical weather here, right? It just suddenly turns. In many places where you have stable weather, you're not used to that. But yeah, it's hard to tell. But we definitely do know. And as Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, mentioned when he was here for Sarah Week, that CO2 is increasing and it's having an impact on the climate.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, we've almost doubled the amount of CO2 from like pre-industrial levels. So like when I was in school, I was taught it was 0.03%, and now it's
Hmm.
0.04%, and that's a huge increase when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like a whole third almost.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No.
So anyway, last week was a bit of a slow week for us, coming back from a very busy week of Sarah Week, where there was a lot going on, lots of side events, lots of receptions. We had our own energy tech market event, and then I think, at least for me, and I think a lot of our founders, there were a lot of follow up conversations
Mm.
from those meetings that they had at Sarah Week. So that was really good. So this last week didn't end up being as slow as I thought it would be.
Yeah. I went to a Greater Houston Partnership event around digital technology here in Houston. It was my first time going. It was a good panel. They had Blair, Remington from CART, and gosh, why do I forget the third person who was up there? But it was a good panel, good crowd, slightly different than usual, and then some usuals, regulars. And I sat talking to one of the VCs there, and they had a different take. And this was a VC coming out of corporate CVC. Their big takeaway from Zero Week was the administration policy is very much focused on resource extraction. And it's not like I think there's this whole drill baby drill like idea. Um, and on the one hand, we can go into kind of the macro on the price of oil, but I think it extends beyond like oil. And kind of the analogy that was shared with me was that if you view the natural resources in the U.S. as like a balance sheet asset, there's actually a lot of resources out there, and we've held them in reserve as a country. There's good reasons for that because a lot of times you have these valuable resources where people aren't and where nature is, um, and it seems like the what some of these folks walked away from the conference thinking is, it's time to tap into U.S. abundance, not necessarily getting it from other places, and understanding that these critical resources are strategic and you just want to have them.
Yeah.
And I think going back, a few weeks ago, I was talking about this discussion out of that group out of ARC, out of Canada. It just kind of reinforces that premise that this is really about the way it's getting parsed and the way it's getting translated is about supply chain resilience and just making sure you have those critical things available. And if you develop them locally and you have the talent to do it locally, then you can also export and create value that way. So it was just an interesting takeaway. I hadn't necessarily heard that from someone else, and
Yeah.
coming through the
Yeah,
lens of someone
yeah.
in corporate venture. Go ahead.
I think that's a good point, that it's not just oil and gas.
Mhm.
And I mean, the US is a big country, right? And
Mhm.
there's so many parts of the US that are still underdeveloped. And, um, we probably know where some of these resources are, and there's probably still many resources that we haven't even gone out to discover. And I think the reason why it hasn't been prioritized is because it's cheaper to do it
Mhm.
elsewhere today. So if we do it here, our labor is more expensive, and our laws are more stringent on how you extract some of these minerals. So with lithium and copper extraction, all these critical minerals that you use for making batteries that go in EVs, there's a lot of talk of how that's done in a very unsustainable way, from Africa.
Mm.
So and I guess because it's unsustainable and often inhumane in many areas, it comes here and it's cheaper. Um, but then obviously when we're going to start extracting minerals here, there's going to be a price tag associated with it, and we're all going to pay for that.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Um,
it was
mm,
an interesting view, but
mm,
no, the GHP event was good. Good food. Caught up. Oh, I remember who the third person was. Mitra Miller at Han. So I had a chance to connect with her a little bit as
mhm.
well. So it was a good panel overall. Um,
Very good.
and yeah. And then what else do we have last week?
So on Friday, we had our Determined to Lead lunch, where we feature women leaders who talk about, their areas of expertise and share it with other, not only women, but other leaders within the energy industry. So we had a packed room this time around, at our location in 820 Gassner, a really good turnout.
Mhm.
And we had two lawyers, Alicia Goodrow and Amy Holmes, who have just joined forces, and are starting their own law firm, and are really focusing around supporting startups on their journeys.
Mhm.
Excuse my throat today,
Yeah.
but I was surprised of how many women showed up. Not only
Mm.
women who were in corporate, a lot of the founders, but also women who are just curious to know, if they were to take the leap as an entrepreneur, what are the things that they should be aware of. I was really impressed with how much they were able to pack in one presentation.
Oh
um,
yeah.
they told us about, like when you're starting a company, the basics. Like for me, okay, LLC is the main advice that you get, but then when you get an accountant, they might advise you to do an S corp because that makes sense to them and that makes the work easier for them, but it might not be the right thing for you. And in that case, don't always just listen to your accountant. Talk to some lawyers and get some advice on, like, what does it mean when you're doing a C corp, S corp, LLC partnership. For some might make sense. So for me, that was a very good discussion and good insight on
All
that
right.
topic.
I'm
Mm.
totally gonna test you, quiz you, and I know you're coming through like a brain fog of like not a good weekend.
Yeah,
But what were the four S's of when to do an S corp?
S corp. It was services for
Uh huh.
sure. Um,
Oh, this is really on the spot.
yeah, it was services. I remember because I was like, okay, I'm doing services.
And the other one I remember was sister company. So
Sister
I
company. I
remember
think there
two
were
of the four.
3. I think there were
Oh,
3
there was
S's.
three.
There was one more.
Okay.
There was
Um,
sister companies, services, and something else. Sharing. I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
but basically, what was interesting, and I think in this example, Alicia like straight up, said her history was coming from corporate in energy in Houston, and had experience at Enron. And she throws up this great chart of like you should have your people here and all your payroll over here, so that's services. You should have your top co, which is kind of like the main business aside to it, and then all the like assets underneath, depending on how you think of dividing up the assets. And I was looking at this chart, going, this looks a lot like Kinder Morgan. This looks like Enron. It looks like a pipeline company, or it looks like an asset-heavy company. And it was just interesting to me because it's never something you would see in the Valley. Because I think the rule in the Valley is, do a Delaware C and issue 1 million shares. I don't even think about it too hard. That's what we did at the Tech Nexus. We set up technically as a PBC, but it's still a certain kind of C corp because I understand vesting and I understand these other things. But really, kind of the lesson here was there are actually ways to kind of carve up the business. And maybe if we want to be a little more tax efficient, we would set ourselves up in an S corp for sister company and services that would lump in all your payroll. But when you look at like big companies, like even I think Shell looks like this a little bit too. You realize like all the people live in an engineering company, and that's the one that kind of sits alongside, and that's where all the kind of payroll and tax lives in there. And I think the other thing that ends up being a little bit of an engineering trick is you do have to do proper accounting between all your different companies, and that's to make sure that the assets are valued correctly. It ends up being a bit more work from a corporate level, but it also allows you to um, um, make sure that there's distinction between the different items. And like one of the key examples she explained is like if you go off and buy a building, you should put the building into an LLC, um, partly to limit liability. But if you charge rent to other people, it becomes its own little business. But if you occupy, you actually have to pay rent to yourself, and that's as much about just proper accounting of value to kind of preserve the different lines, and all that can be done while maintaining ownership in one place. You're not creating kind of taxable events if you push things down into these like fully controlled, fully owned LLCs. So it was very Houston to me.
Yeah, yeah, no, of course. I mean, but I think there's value of like bringing in that experience to um as we're trying to build this ecosystem for startups, like what, because this is what a lot of their corporate partners are used to.
Mhm.
We had also an interesting discussions about safe and convertible notes and how you raise. Um, any thoughts on that as you were listening to that, Jason?
Yeah, no. So I think they were clear about kind of laying out like a convertible note is more investor friendly. It's a negotiated document, so it needs to be a little custom. And safes are very startup friendly, and because they don't really have a due date, there's really not a lot of recourse if things don't go well in the business. Um, and I think part of the reason you go to safes is when you have like a supply led market, when you have startups that are matched well with capital, and everyone's kind of betting on success. And the, I guess the more experienced I get, and the more I've seen kind of over negotiated documents come in, I appreciate kind of having just something simple where everyone just kind of bets on winning. Not because, I think everyone always wants downside protection, but the reality is downside protection doesn't do much for you in a startup where everything is kind of risky anyways. And the less overhead you can have, like the more the company will be successful. And that's the benefit of a safe. I probably like ended up investing like 15% of my time just managing convertible note machinations. Like I think everyone was on board, they liked what we're doing, but because we had to like paper it up properly, every transaction, we would probably put I don't know, 20% of the 15, 20% of my effort and legal effort time into just maintaining those documents the right way and keeping everyone kind of informed and happy. And so it's just expensive on my time when I could go out and be building the business or fundraising, and ultimately didn't seem like it was worth the effort because when we closed down the business, I'm sure the note holders got zero because it was an unsecured note and they had senior secured debt on top of them. And 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 so it's like, what's the point if that makes
Hmm.
any sense? Like, let's just find an easy deal.
Yeah. What are you
Yeah.
actually seeing happening in Houston when people are getting term sheets? In the Valley, safes are very popular and they're pretty normal. And I think also in more mature startup ecosystems like Boston and New
Mhm.
York. But what do you see in Houston mostly?
Yeah, like I threw up a cart .com analysis a while back, and I think they said that within Houston, about 50% of deals now are safe.
Okay.
I think that's I don't know if I've seen it that much in our side of things. I know one of our companies did a save and a convertible note at the same time, which is you can do either or. You can kind of mix the assets together. Um, Safes have less burden in terms of like how do I want to say this? Usually with convertible note, because they're like debt, everyone has to be like together, like pari passu is the word they use. And safes don't necessarily care as much about the other safes that are issued, and so they're a little easier to pull through. So it's a little hard to get kind of data on who's doing what, but it seems like the conversation's there, and the reality is a safe is more startup friendly and a note is more investor
Yeah.
friendly, and it
So
depends
so
on.
big like the
Yeah.
CVCs, for example, which we have a lot of here, the oil and gas companies who have money and want to invest in startups, would they do usually lean towards a convertible note?
I think they would go straight equity. Actually, I don't think
Yeah.
they can hold because
Okay.
technically notes are like debt, like it's
Yeah.
a form of
So they
corporate
would
debt.
just go for equity. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
Mm,
just a little easier, or they would go through an intermediary, like they would invest in a VC who would then do the deal.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I think it's harder for them to do these kind of open assets on like a safe.
mm. And do you think there's a difference when it comes to like SaaS digital types of companies versus hard tech?
Yeah, with software, like there's no hard assets, and it's all about kind of betting product market fit. Like there's no doubt you can build the technology in this day and age, and so I think the safe better aligns with kind of a diversified strategy of like having a lot of investments and kind of going quickly. Um, when you start to get into hard tech, like you start to get real assets, like you could get real estate, you could get these other things, and I'm not saying you should do a convertible note for all those things. Like you can do collateralized um, debt essentially, and that makes a lot more sense. Like we collateralized $1 million of equipment at one point, and I just did a senior secured note at like I think it was 4 above prime or 6 above prime. And what happened is when we weren't able to pay, they seized the asset and then sold it for scrap. But there's more than just those two options. Um, and the thing about debt in my mind is like you need a way to repay the debt. It's
Mm,
just kind of understood there's like a principal or an asset behind it, and
mm,
a lot of times that debt is the business. But it's a lot more meaningful if there's like a real thing behind it, be it
mm.
IP or know-how or trade secrets or real assets. And convertible notes are just this kind of wonky thing where it's like we're technically debt today, but we all expect to be equity later, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Good. And then Alicia has also written a book on kind of summarizing all the things that startups should know about. So you could buy that book
Hmm.
on Amazon. And I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but it was something about napkins, under the napkins, inside the napkins.
We're super prepared this morning.
What was the name of the book? Oh my
So the name of the website they had is like goodbiz.law.
Yeah.
Um, and then let's see if they do have a book in here. I'm just
Yeah,
looking
let
at
me check
the.
on Amazon really quick. Uh,
Oh, anyhow, while you look that up, I'll keep talking here.
yeah,
But
and can you talk a little bit about
yeah,
because you had a really good question about, like, you were talking about patents and trade
yeah,
secrets. Yeah.
yeah. So
Back
one
of
of the
the
things I think
Napkin, that was the name of the book, Back of
Back
the
of the Napkin
Napkin.
is the name of the book. So
Yeah.
one of the things I think that's
Mm,
challenging, and I think maybe will be a little controversial here, is patents are like a liability in my mind. And the thing about a patent is like you have to go out and you have to tell the world what you do, and you have to tell the world why it's distinct and novel and different. And you go out and you build this know-how you have, and you disclose it to everyone. And when you disclose it, it gives you a marker in the sand. It says, "I was first. The U.S. is the first to file system today." And you then tell everyone exactly what you do, and then it starts a clock. Within a year, you have to file a full patent, and then you got to spend whatever $10,000, $15,000 on that, and then you have to go off and then prosecute the patent when they respond, and pretty quickly. Um, you're spending 10, 15, $20,000 to prosecute a patent. It's about 50K all in, assuming inflation hasn't been ridiculous. And then if you want international coverage, that only gives you coverage in the U.S. Then you have to do international coverage in each country. And when you go off and do that, then it's like $30,000 to $50,000 per country because you have to translate it locally. You have to argue why your patent's novel to each local patent office, And so suddenly carrying one patent can be $300,000 of expenses you got to spend over 3 to 5 years. And inevitably, if you're short on cash, or you're doing a seed round, you got to decide: do I want to spend 30 grand defending myself in this other place, or do I want to spend it on engineering or getting an asset in or deploying into the field? And unfortunately, with IP, it's one of those things where you've kind of shown everyone how it's done. Um, Trade secrets, on the other hand, are something where you know how it's done, you document how it's done, you create a corpus of knowledge of this kind of know-how where you're an expert in the world. You treat it like a patent, like you document it like a patent, but then you only share it with certain people and you control it. And when you have an investment, you can put in the data room and say, I have this thing, and then under super strong NDA, you're allowed to look at it after we sign or after we're going to be serious. And the same with it, like a partner or a JV partner. And your best protection of that is not showing everyone all the parts, but having kind of selective information going out and restricting it internally. But the thing about trade secret is it's yours. Like even if you go sign an NDA, no one can copy you because you can trace the lineage to your data room or your source of IP. And then the other thing is when you have a trade secret, you um, you can still practice it if someone else patents that technique later. You got to prove it. You got to go to court. You got to get out there and say, look, here's my priority date. I documented it internally here. But the advantage it gives you is that you don't have to tell the world how it's done. You don't always patent everything anyways, so you get to keep some of that inside. The major value of a patent is you have exclusivity in the world to prepare something. But for your startup, you can still practice if you have trade secret. And so what I'm saying is a patent is a liability early on. When you go off and raise $5 to $10 million, yes, go off and go patent. That gives you the exclusivity. That gives you kind of the value. It helps you ensure you can capture the value of what you developed. But in the early days, it's unclear to me if getting stuff out there and patented are worthwhile as long as you do the documentation internally, because it's such a big burden if you have to
Mm.
spend 200,
Yeah,
$300,000, right?
exactly. And I think for me, a lot of times, because when I go to like the Rice Business Plan competition or these other competitions, and you have like all types of judges from like different experience levels, and I have a lot of like judges who are angel investors, like really focusing, I think over focusing on like IP and patent, like how are you going to protect this? And as an investor, when I'm investing in a company, for me, what's more important is like the team's ability to execute on this,
Mm,
because you can always invent something, and there's always a risk of someone taking your technology or making something similar, right? But what's going to set you apart from a competitor is your ability to build a team, to get investors, to scale. And there's so much more than just like the actual core of the technology in
mm.
terms of like building a business around it. For me, at least personally, I don't know what you have seen from investors. Do you think some investors are actually care a lot more about IP, and should they be?
Yeah, so I think there's two things here. So one,
Mm,
not everyone knows how to get a patent issued, and so it feels
mm,
like a big thing. You can get anyone can get a patent written. The
mm,
examiner doesn't know what's going on. They don't understand the technology, and as long as you narrow down kind of your claims enough, anyone can get a patent. It's not hard. It's just expensive. So like, why would you do it if you weren't claiming something valuable? But uh, there's a lot of like tacit knowledge, right? And so like Evan's is a well, and my issue, Evan, is like when you issue the provisional patent, you're telling everyone how things work, and so you technically a good provisional, you can hold your spot, but like technically there's an opportunity for someone to um, complain that you just are like stuffing the ballot with spots and not actually putting in material content. And so the risk is like once you do that, even if you don't use it, you've kind of told the world a little bit of your novelty because of all the content you put in. Um, so one of the things I will say is Evan here is an expert in like how to make cathode materials and how to make battery materials, and and um, he probably knows all the different ways you can put this together, all the unique ways to put it together. And that's a lot that you don't necessarily say, right? You don't decide to execute the patent or put it out there until you have decent confidence that you want to deploy and you have a strategy that's going to create value. And And I think when people look at intellectual property and know-how, they're looking for someone like an Evan on the team who can get you to the result. And in Evan's case, he was developing a cathode, like a recipe for cathode material, right? And he had come from a background. Uh, talking about it. He was coming from a background where he had worked with the world's best, was one of the world's best experts in this technology. I would look at Evan and say, like, I don't really need patents until we're actually going to deploy like 10 or $20 million because I have high confidence he knows what he's doing, right? Now, the thing is, though, Evan came out of university. So out of the university system, um, you are publishing your results because you're a PhD and the goal is to publish. And in that case, you are disclosing what you do. And so because it's already out there in the public domain, then that clock of like disclosure is already ticking. So then you do want to get a patent in place if you're coming out of academia because there's this fine line of like who owns it. So you want to have the patent out there that like draws a circle around this is the thing we're licensing out, and we have a hold on that. And you will see a lot of startups go through business plan competitions where they're like the inventor had invented it, they're a student, they want to pull the technology out. They don't have anything in paper yet because they're just starting, and you want to define that, get that. You want to say that you have that because otherwise you have nothing because the university technically has that and protects it. But the other reality is, if you meet a lot of entrepreneurs who work on a hard tech, they'll tell you in retrospect you define most of your IP after you start, like after you put engineering to work and you find all these other non-obvious things that is important, and maybe the IP that you license out originally is like 5% of the stuff. You still need it. It's still foundational. It's still important, but it's not as valuable of like as running the engineering exercise. And so, like the analogy here, and I'll go back to Evan. Sorry to pick on you, Evan. It's like yes, you know how to build the technology at small scale, but when you start to build your gigafactory or your mass factory, there's all this like stuff you have to figure out to go from test tube kind of development to scale development, where you realize you're spending a lot of capital to develop this other know-how that is far and beyond the original piece of IP. And that's what you're spending the engineering resources on, right? You're developing this know-how, and the know-how for manufacturing is almost always trade secret, at least in the U.S. Rarely do you go into a factory and do they patent like the path you take to like mill a machine out or how you do casting. They might patent like the general process, but a lot of value is in just setting up your supply chain. Right. So different types of IP, as I think Jan is talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's only also one kind of moat. So the ability to build a team and execute is another form
So,
of a moat. Yeah.
So just to come back, early on, IP, like patents are a liability. Trade secrets are an asset. Trade know-how is an asset. But like once you start to get it issued, it's going to cost you money. But like once you raise that Series A, yeah, go out and get it patented. It's just you want to make sure you have the balance sheet for it, and you don't want to be stuck between losing everything and putting food on the table or keeping the business alive. Right? That's what I would caution people with is not putting that ticking clock in place too soon.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you have to be able to see, like, are you going to be able to get to Series A in the first place
Yeah.
when you make that investment?
Yeah.
And method patents are hard to enforce, so that's an interesting
Oh
point.
man, yeah, you got to go off and sue people, and it's a question of who has a bigger balance sheet at that point.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So yeah, that was a great event. I think so. We often don't focus so much on the legal aspects of like your company and all that it involves. So I think it was really good to do that session with Determined to Lead, and something that we want to do more going forward for our founders. Also with our partnership with some of the law firms here, it'll be good to especially if this is of interest, do more informative sessions on that topic. So in terms of what's coming up for next week, we have our Founders and Funders Fusion that we call the F3 happening on Thursday on Green Street. And Jason, you have booked the space for this. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the space where we're doing it?
This is going to be part of the Tech Roundup. For those of you who used to remember that was like Tech Rodeo. It used to happen during the rodeo. I think now they've moved it over. And part of it's taking place at Green Street, and then obviously there's a session at the Ion in Greentown and other places. And so we're going to do our happy hour on Thursday as normally scheduled, but we decided to do it at Tom's Bar, which is a sports bar. Hopefully, it's not too noisy, but should be a fun location. And so we'll be part of that. I think the other thing I would say is in years past, I found the H-Town Roundup more focused on people trying to transition into being an entrepreneur in Houston. So those more panels and workshops that were kind of exploring what it means to start a company. Usually, just as a more experienced entrepreneur, I kind of want to go to places that either have investors or have kind of a deeper engagement with our target market. But that being said, it's good networking. It's a good time to kind of get across to other parts of the ecosystem. Obviously, we're very energy centric. And this is a good opportunity to go to like Tech and Tequila, for example, where you get to engage with people like the Blue People specifically, and learn about other parts of our ecosystem. And so it's a pretty decent week. And it's run by Houston Exponential. And so should be a decent program.
Yeah. And at our founder F3 events, we're also going to be running like mini panel series. So we're going to feature 2 to 3 investors every time. This time we have Willy Verbrugge. Hard to say his last name, but he's going to be there. He's a very experienced entrepreneur, been in Houston for many, many years. And he'll share some of his insights. So we'll be kind of, still making it very informal since it is at a bar, but he'll say a few words about his investment thesis and we get an opportunity to ask him questions. And we want, we're going to try to repeat this if it works for our founders, for all of our F3s. So
Yeah.
look out for that.
I might need you to bring the audio system down. I got to call Tom's and see if they have a PA, but we'll find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it would even work, right? But so we have to kind of figure out how does it work in that kind of an environment to
Yeah.
do a mini panel. Mm.
Good.
Good. And then we have a founder circle, something that we
Mhm.
do for all our founders as Energy Tech Nexus members. We have a coach come in and we do a CEO circle
Mhm.
where we sit around and kind of share some of our things that we're battling with right now and get some coaching and advice on that. And most of our founders who've attended it found it very, very valuable. So I'm looking forward to another kind of deep dive into
Yeah.
what it's like being a founder.
And it's structured as a mastermind, so it's peer coaching at its finest. You with others who are going through the same thing, and the coach is there to facilitate kind of learning from your peers. And how this is different from other programs is everyone's kind of in a high growth startup in the early days, all the way through building teams of 50 or more, and different from other groups where maybe the executives are growing at kind of lifestyle speed businesses. So really trying to bring the tacit knowledge of our ecosystem together.
Yeah, so that one's on Wednesday. And you can find out more information about that on our Luma or just follow us on LinkedIn and you'll get updates. Um, and if you're not subscribing to our newsletter, do subscribe to that. Just go on our website, energytechnexus.com. And if you just scroll all the way down, there's a box there where you can subscribe to our newsletter. Yeah,
Good.
with
Uh,
that, yeah, anything else?
no, I was looking at financings for the last week. It seemed like it was kind of slow within climate. A lot of things in health and AI. Didn't necessarily see that much. So I guess everyone is deal making after 0 week, not necessarily ready to deploy capital yet. So didn't have much to add there.
Yeah,
I think that's it.
yeah,
All right. I guess we'll see you guys throughout the week.
yeah. Thank you for listening.
All right. See you.
Bye.